The laughter stopped so suddenly, it felt like someone had pulled the plug on happiness itself. Jimmy Fallon's signature smile froze mid-expression as he watched Audrey Hobert's face crumble in real time. What had started as a light-hearted conversation about love songs had just become something else entirely, something raw, something that would make everyone in Studio 6B remember why they fell in love with music in the first place. It was Tuesday night at 30 Rock, and the energy in the Tonight Show studio was electric as always. The Roots were laying down their signature groove, the audience was buzzing with anticipation, and Jimmy was in his element. Audrey Hobert, the 24-year-old singer-songwriter, whose debut album had just hit #1, sat across from him in the iconic red guest chair. She looked every inch the rising star in her vintage band t-shirt and perfectly imperfect curls, but something in her eyes suggested depths that her pop princess image didn't reveal. The interview had been going perfectly. Jimmy had made her laugh with his spot-on impression of her viral TikTok dance. She'd shared funny stories about her cat interrupting Zoom writing sessions during quarantine, and the audience was eating up every moment of their easy chemistry. But when Jimmy leaned forward with that genuine curiosity that made him such a beloved host, and asked, "Your song Midnight Promise is so beautiful, so romantic. Tell us about the person who inspired that." The atmosphere in the studio shifted like a cloud passing over the sun. Audrey's smile flickered. For just a moment, her carefully constructed media persona slipped, and Jimmy caught a glimpse of something vulnerable underneath. She fidgeted with the silver ring on her thumb, a nervous habit he'd noticed during commercial breaks. She started, then stopped. "That's actually a really interesting question, Jimmy." The audience chuckled, thinking she was being coy about revealing a celebrity romance. Entertainment blogs had been speculating about her love life for months, linking her to everyone from her guitarist to various actors she'd been photographed with at industry events. But Jimmy, who had developed an instinct for reading people after years of late-night conversations, sensed this wasn't about protecting someone's privacy. Jimmy said with his characteristic warmth, "The way you sing 'I've been dreaming of your coffee-stained mornings', the way you hum while doing dishes. That's so specific, so intimate. That has to come from somewhere real, right?" Audrey looked down at her hands, and when she looked back up, her eyes were glassy. The studio lights caught the unshed tears, creating tiny prisms that somehow made the moment feel even more fragile. "Jimmy," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying perfectly through the hushed studio. "Can I tell you something that I've never told anyone before?" Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that would define this moment forever. He could have made a joke, lightened the mood, steered the conversation back to safer territory. Instead, he leaned forward, his full attention focused on this young woman who clearly needed to be heard. "Of course," he said, his voice stripped of all performance, all entertainment value. This was just Jimmy, the human being, offering space for truth. Audrey took a shaky breath. "I wrote that song about someone who doesn't exist." The confession hung in the air like a note that hadn't quite finished resonating. The studio audience, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented, fell completely silent. Even the Roots seemed to hold their breath. "What do you mean?" Jimmy asked gently. Exactly that," Audrey said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "Every detail in that song, the coffee-stained mornings, the humming while doing dishes, the way he supposedly holds me when I can't sleep. I made it all up. I wrote a love letter to a person who exists only in my imagination." Jimmy's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, of the profound loneliness that statement revealed. "I've never had that," Audrey continued, tears now flowing freely. "I've never had someone who knows how I like my coffee, or who hums unconsciously while doing mundane things. I've never had someone hold me through a nightmare, or leave little notes in my lunch, but I wanted it so badly that I wrote it. I wrote the love I've never experienced, and sang it like it was real." The camera caught Jimmy's reaction. The way his jaw slightly dropped, the way he instinctively reached across the space between them, as if to comfort her. This wasn't the polished talk show host anymore. This was a man witnessing another human being's raw vulnerability. Audrey, he started, but she wasn't finished. People think it's about my ex-boyfriend from high school, or they speculate about some secret celebrity romance. But the truth is so much more embarrassing than that. The truth is I'm 24 years old, and I've never been in love. Real love. The kind of love where someone sees all of you and stays anyway. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup, but somehow looking more beautiful for the imperfection. I wrote that song at 3 a.m. in my apartment, crying over a pint of ice cream, imagining what it would feel like to have someone who chose me every morning. Someone who found my weird habits endearing instead of annoying. Someone who loved me, not because I'm Audrey Hobert the singer, but because I'm Audrey the girl who talks to her plants and cries during dog food commercials. The silence in the studio was profound. Jimmy sat back in his chair, clearly processing what he'd just heard. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Do you know how brave you are?" he asked. Audrey looked up, surprised. "Brave? I just admitted I'm a fraud who writes love songs about imaginary relationships." "No," Jimmy said firmly, standing up from his desk. "You just admitted something that probably half the people in this studio, half the people watching at home, can relate to, but would never have the courage to say out loud." He walked around his desk, sat on the edge closer to her, abandoning all the physical barriers that television typically maintains between host and guest. "You wrote hope into existence," he continued. "You created the love you wanted to feel, and shared it with millions of people who probably needed to hear those words, needed to believe that kind of love was possible." The camera operator, who had been filming talk shows for over a decade, later said he'd never seen anything like what happened next. Jimmy Fallon, the man who had built his career on laughter and light moments, looked directly into the camera with tears in his eyes. If you're watching this and you've ever felt what Audrey just described, if you've ever written letters to people who don't exist, if you've ever imagined conversations with your future person, if you've ever felt alone in a world full of people, you're not broken, you're not pathetic, you're human, and you're hoping, and that's beautiful. "I kept it a secret because I thought people would think less of me," she whispered. "Successful artists are supposed to write from experience, from real life. I felt like a fraud selling people emotions I'd only imagined. But here's the thing," Jimmy said, his voice gentle but certain. "Imagination is a form of experience. Longing is real. Hope is real. The fact that you could create something so beautiful from nothing but a wish. That's not fraud. That's magic." The studio audience, who had been silent throughout this exchange, began to applaud softly. Not the raucous, prompted applause of typical late-night television, but the kind of clapping that acknowledges something sacred has just happened. But Jimmy wasn't done. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, his personal one, where he jotted down ideas and thoughts throughout the day. "I want to tell you something," he said, flipping through pages. "I've been married for years. I have kids. I have what looks like a perfect life. But sometimes, I still write in this notebook about the person I wish I could be for my family. The husband who never gets frustrated. The dad who always knows the right thing to say. I write letters to the version of myself I'm still trying to become." He showed her a page covered in his handwriting. "We all write love letters to people who don't exist yet, including future versions of ourselves. You just had the courage to turn yours into art." The moment stretched between them, filled with understanding and connection that transcended the typical boundaries of television. "Can I ask you something?" Jimmy said softly. "When you perform that song now, how does it feel?" Audrey considered the question, really thought about it. "It feels like I'm casting a spell. Like maybe if I sing it enough times, with enough conviction, the universe will hear me. and send me someone who recognizes the words. And maybe, Jimmy said with a small smile, someone watching tonight who has felt the same way you do will recognize themselves in your song. Maybe your imaginary love letter will help real love letters get written. The truth of his words seemed to hit her like a gentle revelation. Her tears slowed, and for the first time since the conversation began, she smiled. Not the practiced media smile, but something genuine and hopeful. I never thought of it that way, she said. That's what the best art does, Jimmy replied. It takes our private pain, our secret hopes, our imaginary worlds, and makes them real for other people. You didn't write a fake song. You wrote an honest one about what love could look like. As if summoned by the moment's magic, someone in the audience called out, "Sing it for us." Others joined in, a gentle chorus of voices, asking for the song they now understood in a completely different way. Audrey looked to Jimmy, who nodded encouragingly. "Would you like to?" he asked. "We could just forget about the format for a minute. No big production, no backing track, just you and the truth you just shared." Audrey nodded, wiping her eyes one final time. Jimmy gestured to the Roots, who understood immediately. Questlove started a simple, soft rhythm, and Tariq began a gentle guitar melody. Standing in the middle of the studio, makeup smudged, vulnerability on full display, Audrey began to sing. But this time, the words carried different weight. Every lyric about imagined intimacy, every line about longing, every verse about hope deferred, but not abandoned. It all rang with the honesty of her confession. The audience listened in reverent silence, understanding now that they were hearing not just a song, but a prayer, a wish, a brave admission of what it means to hope for love in a world that often makes connection feel impossible. When she finished, the silence lasted a full 5 seconds before the applause began. Not polite television applause, but the kind of recognition that happens when people witness something real, break through the pretense of performance. Jimmy walked over to her, and without saying a word gave her a hug. Not a Hollywood air kiss, not a photo op embrace, but the kind of hug that says, "I see you, and your truth is safe here." When they separated, he looked at her with eyes still bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting us with that." Later, after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience filed out, Jimmy and Audrey talked for another 20 minutes in his dressing room. Not for content, not for publicity, but because something real had been shared and neither of them wanted to let it go too quickly. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no edits to soften Audrey's revelation or Jimmy's response. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Love Letter to Nobody began trending within hours. Thousands of people shared their own stories of loneliness, of imagined relationships, of songs and poems and letters written to people who existed only in hope. More importantly, the comment sections filled with people reaching out to each other. Strangers offering friendship, support groups forming around shared loneliness. And yes, real love stories beginning between people who recognized something true in Audrey's confession. 6 months later, Audrey received a letter that would change everything. It was from a songwriter in Portland named David, who had watched that episode and felt every word in his bones. He had been writing his own love letters to nobody, crafting melodies for imaginary conversations, hoping for the same connection Audrey had described. Their first email exchange lasted 6 hours. Their first phone call lasted until sunrise. Their first meeting felt like coming home. A year later, Audrey released a new song called Real Now, her first love song written about an actual person. But in interviews, she always credited Midnight Promise as the song that made it possible. Sometimes, she would say, "You have to sing the love you want to have before you can recognize the love you're meant to receive." And Jimmy Fallon, who had witnessed the moment when loneliness transformed into hope, kept that notebook close at hand, remembering that the most powerful performances happen when we stop performing and start being human.